we'll get started. There's a handful of people that are still connecting, so they'll join us as we start. As I said, welcome to our session this afternoon with OHO. I have Claire Rogers with me. I'll do a formal introduction in a moment to let you know who she is and her role, and hand over. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and waters of the country I'm on, the Butchulla people. I also wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and waters of the countries wherever you may be linking in from. Pay my respects to elders past and present and young leaders of today and the future, to also any Aboriginal people that might be joining with us in this session. Also wish to acknowledge the lifelong trauma of abuse victims, survivors, their families, and the failures of the Catholic Church to protect, believe, and respond justly to children and vulnerable adults, and the consequent breach of community trust. I have just an infographic there, and I'm just going to speak very, very briefly. This is an opportunity to just share ACSL, Australian Catholic Safeguarding Limited, and just highlight a couple of things in relation to what we do, knowing that many of you would have had interactions and engagement with us when we were CPSL, Catholic Professional Standards Limited. So there have been some slight changes, namely the members of the company, so who has established us. We are a company set up by the Australian Catholic Bishops Conference, so that's the ACBC, Catholic Religious Australia, CRA, and the Association of Ministerial PJPs. So that's all the other sides, basically this other side of the church, and all three members make up the Catholic Church in Australia largely. We have been set up to support church authorities and build a culture of safeguarding and ensure national oversight for the policies, procedures, and culture within Catholic entities, with special respect to safeguarding children and adults at risk. We also support, as requested, in matters relating to some church protocols, namely Vos Estis Lux Mundi, which deals with complaints of sexual abuse of minors, and also be a single point of reference for church authorities in relation to the implementation support, capacity building around safeguarding, and particularly the National Catholic Safeguarding Standards. And the other part of that is also supporting when it comes to compliance, audit, and review. So today we're clicking off a few things, but just an opportunity to share where we sit and some of the changes that have happened recently with the transition from CPSL to ACSL. I'm going to hand over to Claire Rogers. Claire is the Executive Director of OHO. OHO is a social purpose business that focuses on automating credentials and verification of staff, volunteers, and contractors for organisations who work with children and vulnerable people. Claire was previously the CEO of World Vision Australia, which is the country's largest not-for-profit organisation, and has extensive global and local experience in multiple financial service divisions, namely with the ANZ, where she was also the head of digital banking for a stint. Claire has a few other positions and connected to multiple other entities. Claire's married with 2 children and worships at St. Jude's. Claire, thank you for being with us today. And I'll hand over and we'll, as much as possible, make this conversational. But thank you, and you have the floor.
Great, thanks, Daniel. And it's just lovely to be with you all today. Thanks for coming on to talk about this important issue. It's really lovely that we did the acknowledgement of country at the beginning, actually, because as we look back, Indigenous children are overrepresented in cases of abuse, and so this is a really important conversation in the light of the fact that we are on the lands of the Wurundjeri people in my case, but many other tribes around Australia as you dial in. What I'd like to do is just give you a bit of context for why we're here today. And OHO's mission is that together, if we work together, we can help stop abuse. And we share a vision that I'm sure with your commitment coming on today, you share with us, that every vulnerable person in Australia is protected. And I think by working together, we can make this vision a reality. We're going to look specifically at this, what I call foundational piece of accreditations, and predominantly today we'll talk about working with children, but working with children checks. But there are a number of other important accreditations that either substitute for a working with children check, such as a teacher's license. There are also health professionals qualifications that, with the appropriate verification, protect from malpractice. And obviously coming in the disability space and aged care are at least the disability worker card, which we know about, but the intel we're hearing, and I'm sure you're across it too, is that it's likely that card will be expanded to include people working with aged care. So this idea of these verifications being really important to ensure that everyone who works in your organisation is suitable to work with the vulnerable, be that a child or someone with a disability or someone in aged care. One of the first important questions that we get asked a lot about is, what is child-related work? And actually, I just saw a lovely question. I will just explain what OHO stands for, because that does, I think, provide some context, and then we'll jump into the training session. So OHO is actually named after an Eurasian eagle owl that has incredible vision to see into the dark and into the most faraway corners, but at the same time can immediately translate its vision to microscopic sight of a problem. And so the analogy is that we stand beside you like a Eurasian eagle owl, watching for any change in the status of your accreditations so that you can concentrate on your mission. So that's the story of the name of OHO. Thanks, Daniel. If we can go back to the slides now. So as I was saying, this first important question is, what is child-related work? And if you've had any experience in this area, you will find that the registers around the different states, they provide guidelines, but they don't like to be providing formal advice. It is an organisational decision. The sort of common themes, though, of course, are that contact with children is a usual part of and more than incidental to the work. And the work involves physical contact, face-to-face contact, oral communication, written, or indeed, really importantly now, electronic communication with a child. And you should be aware that grooming has increased in the online space quite dramatically as a result of COVID. So any assumptions about it, the electronic environment not being the same as in the real world is not correct. So you do need the same levels of vigilance in delivering services digitally. And then there are some specific sectors prescribed by the Working with Children Check scheme. I know today we're talking to a wide range of organisations, both clergy or ministerial roles. I've used a little graphic here for the lay in the church, of which I'm definitely one, because I have served running Sunday schools and various things, youth programs over my life. And then, of course, those who are in direct delivery of care and services for the vulnerable. So there's no one answer to this, but it is a very valid question that you need to grapple with on a regular basis and keep checking in on. So most organisations are, I think, not necessarily fully aware of the scope of their obligations. And that's largely because we have such varying legal requirements across states, territories and industries. Australia lacks a national Working with Children check scheme, and I'm sure there are some people passionate about us eventually getting to that. But it isn't looking like it's going to be here anytime soon, which means that we have to rely on the state agencies to provide that worker and volunteer registration in each jurisdiction. Again, if you work across borders in Australia, that you'll know that there's no uniform process requirement or integration that applies for the whole of Australia. So each register is basically performing the same function, but in a different way. So this presents pretty serious challenges for organisations, especially, as I said, those across state borders. But there are also unique little challenges for ensuring that your people are safe in each of the state registers, and we can talk about some of that. And I've seen some of your questions that have come through, and we will spend some time on that in Q&A. So not only do you have to get your head around the different legal requirements in each state, but then you've got this heavy administrative burden to ensure that the workers you engage are compliant and up to date with the right accreditations. And let me just talk briefly about this up to date. So many organisations have focused on the onboarding process when I'm hiring someone or I'm asking someone to perform a lay role in a church, and I've verified that that card is valid. Many organisations stop there. That is the end of the conversation in terms of managing verifications. The problem with that is that verifications, these cards are revoked, and I can give you the statistics for all the eastern seaboard states. In Victoria, it's 1 per day is revoked. In New South Wales, it's near enough to 3 per day, and Queensland have just announced their new numbers, and it's 3 per day. In the smaller states, it's 1 every couple of working days. And in this day and age where people work in multiple organisations, you may find that there's an offence committed in another organisation that affects a card. And unless you're verifying and ensuring that those cards are up to date, then you're running the risk of deploying someone in child-related work without a valid Working with Children check. And we'll give you some examples of some things we've found in our client base as we go through. So just to summarise, there is a prohibition on employing a worker in child-related work without a valid Working with Children check. The legislation is not written explicitly to say that you need to do ongoing verification, but there is an onus on verifying information, and I'll show you some of the penalties and rules around that. There is, of course, a requirement to have record keeping, and again, I'll talk about how OHO can keep records for you, but there is a significant record keeping obligation. And then the newer legislation around information sharing when you're asked by another organisation to share information. We won't spend a lot of time on number 4 today because that's another domain in this area, but we'll look quite closely at 1, 2 and 3. So what do organisations need to do? First of all, ensure the right accreditations are verified. Second, actively monitor those accreditations. Design and implement a risk strategy around what are you going to do when an accreditation is revoked. And then maintaining accurate records for reporting. Now let's talk about the implications of not getting this right. And I know that some of you will have personally experienced the amnesty that the New South Wales OCG offered until the 30th of June. There are fines, jail time and reputational losses are some of the significant costs that an organisation or its officers could face if it's found to have committed an offence. In some jurisdictions, an organisation's senior executive or board can be held individually accountable, and that's because they've changed since the Royal Commission into institutional child abuse. Since the Royal Commission, the Wrongs Act has been changed. In most states and in those that haven't yet, there's legislation proposed where the onus is on the organisation to prove that they took reasonable care rather than what was historically the onus being on the victim to prove that they weren't cared for properly. And so that immediately puts senior executive and board in the frame for individually being held accountable. There are sizable variations in the penalties, and if we go to the next slide, I'll just give you some visibility of those penalties and why they would be applied. So the first is obviously not to employ a person in child-related work where they don't hold a valid working with children check. You shouldn't employ prohibited, suspended or disqualified people. So that one really relates to the onboarding process. If they've not passed their tests, they shouldn't be employed. If the senior executives and members of the governing bodies fail to hold a working with children check, failing to verify information, confirming the type of working with children check provided and keeping records, and non-compliance with regulatory action taken under the relevant scheme. So these are the things that could cause a penalty to be applied. And if we go to the next slide, this is the actual wording in the three major states, the three eastern seaboard states. Every state is important. And I think, we don't have to read this line by line, but I find the Victorian one very interesting. And you can see I've just put in bold that the person knows the worker does not have a current working with children check or is reckless as to that fact. Now, if you're not doing ongoing verification, then there's, I think, an element of recklessness. And so we consider this a really important foundational protection element, that you would have not only a check happening when I hire someone or deploy someone into a task in my church, or bring a volunteer into my aged care or disability service where children might be present. The reality is just checking and verifying will not make you a child safe organisation, and Daniel and I have had a talk about this. However, it's a really important foundational piece, because if we allow people in, or we don't remove people who've lost the right to have that accreditation, then all our other programs around culture, around training, around encouraging children to use their voice when they're seeing things that they're not comfortable with, all of those things become null and void in a way, because we know that someone in this situation is not going to follow those processes. So I do encourage you to think about this as your foundational piece. The other reason this is really, I think, an important thing to think about is, if I had, child safety resources in the organisation, getting the administration sorted in an automated fashion is a way that I can free those resources up to concentrate on the other standards. Verifying is very difficult. Some of you will be very experienced in this. In each of the registers, it's basically has to be done one at a time, and that's a very long process if you've got a lot of staff. So automation takes that burden, and you end up, it's not an exciting job. Your volunteers could be better deployed actually delivering ministry and services. So it's a balance, but our encouragement to you is to be verifying frequently, but also to consider, are there other ways you can do this from an automation point of view, so that you can put your resources on the high value cultural aspects of child safety. Next slide. Thanks, Daniel. So being compliance fit, what happens when the regulator knocks? Well, and they are shifting from a capability build. A lot of them have been around now 15, 20 years. They're now starting to shift into this, let's come and do an audit. Let's verify that you're doing this properly. And there are, there's more teeth coming, I think, in the regulator's activity, and therefore there will be more penalties. There are already penalties that have been issued, and I think we're going to see that increase. The challenges that you need to be ready, well, this has to be something that's important in your organisation and needs to be adequately resourced. You do need appropriate policies, but you also need procedures and operational systems to bring those policies to life. It's not enough to have good policies on the shelf. It is important to have risk mitigations and controls to substantiate that those policies matter in your organisation. And I think the other thing we talk about here, and this might tackle some of the questions that have been coming through in the chat, there are a lot of assumptions in organisations about the registries and what they will and won't do, and why verification may or may not be happening. And the first assumption is that the registers will tell me if there's a problem. Now, in some states that is true, and I know there was a question earlier before the meeting around New South Wales, and I'll come to the detail of some of that question later. But the first thing to say, though, about New South Wales, they do linking very well because it's driven by the organisational level. So you have to set up the link in your organisation to the individual, and there's protection in that because of the opposite is true in Victoria. So in Victoria, I control the linking as an employee, and I can set it up to get a job, and then 2 weeks later I can remove it, and organisations won't be told. So one of the ways OHO protects you in Victoria is that we check every person you tell us is working for you, regardless of whether the linking is in place. The second assumption is that everyone in my organisation the register knows, and everyone in my organisation is linked. And this is where New South Wales and Queensland and South Australia are important because to think about, because while they do have organisational linking, it's very difficult to audit whether every person in your organisation has been linked. Sorry, I'm already talking too much. Got a tickle in my throat. The second assumption is that because I've put this into a system, sometimes a HR system, excuse me, that's the first time that's happened for a while, that because I've recorded the number in my system, then I'm okay. Well, actually there are very few. In fact, we haven't found a single system, HR system or CRM or member-based system. We haven't found a single system that's going off to the registries and checking those numbers. So even if you're recording the number, that's important, but how do you know if that number's right? So that's actually not a protection for your organisation. And the third assumption is that, as we talked about, that the register will tell me if there's a problem. And the way I like to think about this is it's the register's primary job is to make sure that I should have a Working with Children check card. It's not to make sure that the organisation does what it's responsible for. And that is to make sure that if I hire that person and continue to hire that person, that they have a valid Working with Children check card. And so these are the challenges and the things I'd encourage you to think about to be ready for when a regulator might come knocking on the door. Daniel, next slide. Thank you. So what we have learned, let me share a little bit about our real experiences with our customers. I've already shared the number of times a Working with Children check card is revoked each day. We've found just in the last 8 weeks 4 known red flags where people needed to be stood down. We've found 95% of organisations are not doing any verification beyond onboarding. 100% of our clients say we've helped them find people they needed to remove from access. We found linkage failures, even in states that have tight processes, and I'll talk about some of those in a minute. Data error rates. So like I was saying before, wherever you're recording your numbers, when we come to upload them into OHO, we're finding very, very high error rates. And that's because each state has a different set of data that they require to do the verification. And as I said before, this is not a very exciting job. And so sometimes people are just making mistakes as they collect that data. Sometimes we've found people who've stretched the expiry dates in the data that they've provided their employer. So one of the other things that gets verified is not only the currency of the card, but also when its true expiry date is. And that's important because an incorrect expiry date, you might leave them in situ too long. As we've talked about, assumptions about the responsibility being with the registry, not the organisation. Some profoundly naive excuses for not needing verification. One that, I share with this audience because I think it's important that we understand that we don't like to think that there might be somebody in our community that we know who might not be suitable. And, what we learnt from the Royal Commission and we know from experience is that predators hide in plain sight. So, an organisation told us that we don't need to verify because all the men in our organisation are over the age of 65 and they're not interested in sex. That's an extreme excuse, and then we come right back through lots of other reasons why it's not perceived as necessary. Overwhelmed or disengaged administrative staff grappling with spreadsheets and paper. We've found government entities who are not checking their own people. And the other thing we've done is had a survey of parents of children and carers who and asked them what they know about the Working with Children check and what their expectations are of organisations. And their expectations are that organisations are doing this all the time to ensure that those caring for their children are safe to do so. And the other thing we found was that parents worry about this a lot. And so what we've built at OHO is a badge that people can put on their organisational website or on the doors of their offices of their facilities that says we are an OHO community member, and that provides some of that reassurance around the checks being done on an ongoing basis. And of course, I read the stories, as you probably watch the stories. We continue to have almost every week someone's reported in the media, and when you read the story, we can tell that there wasn't adequate checking done. So it's an area that we kind of refer to as a bit of a blind spot, not even a bit, a large blind spot in organisational child safety frameworks. And having a mitigation of this risk in place is a really wise thing to do. OHO's here to help, but we're not saying we're the only way you should do this. We encourage you and we want to see all the children in Australia protected. Thanks, Daniel. And what we'll do now is just share a video from our founder, Daniel Margaridge.
When I was a kid, we were always out playing in the dirt, bare feet, making and riding bikes. Parents were nowhere to be seen. It's not the same today. We live in bigger cities with many more people. Technology has massively entered our lives. Community bonds have diminished, and trust in our neighbourhoods has weakened. Human nature hasn't changed, but there's just more opportunity for things to go wrong. Children, people with disabilities and others in care are vulnerable to poor practice, or in worse cases, to abuse. Government accreditation schemes record the compliance of workers. Compliance with expectations of competency, but also with the expectations of the community. In that sense, government accreditation schemes are a proxy for the good character of workers. And that is why accreditations are so important. Too many employers are unaware of their obligations. Most have substandard systems for administering registrations. They might check a worker when first employed and that's it. They also don't know if a worker who has left the company has been struck off a registry. Abusers don't just strike once. In November 2014, the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse began. A close friend and colleague of mine is a survivor. I joined as they took the incredibly brave step of providing a witness statement at that inquiry. That day changed my life, to face the darkest side of humanity and see witness after witness present just one day of the commission that spanned 4 long years. So, our team asked ourselves, how could we, a technology consulting business, play our part in stopping abuse and the negligent harm of people in our care? We had to acknowledge that some people will always seek to abuse others, but we can build fences around them. And that's why we created OHO, a system that keeps watch every second of every day. OHO provides continuous validation, rapid notification, expiry management, and evidence of due diligence. It does it all in one place. And any organisation of any size can jump on board. Every Australian should ask the question, how many times is it acceptable for a vulnerable person to be abused? When is it ever okay? Because the answer is never. Be certain.
So in summary, OHO keeps a constant watch on staff and volunteer accreditations. And as we've talked about, failure to continuously monitor and validate those accreditations beyond the hiring process exposes organisations caring for the vulnerable to predators and malpractice. You can see down at the bottom the licenses and accreditations that we're able to validate on an ongoing basis, and we've got some others coming as well. Police checks will, and I'm sure there'll be a question about that in the chat, that's coming in the next 3 months as well. We'll have a quick look at how OHO works, and then we'll get into the questions.
If you employ people who care for others, you need to know they're qualified, accredited, and safe. Your customers expect you to know, because any incident of abuse is one too many. OHO gives you extra eyes on the safety of your people. We use technology to continuously verify the accreditation of employees, volunteers, and contractors, not just the day they start, but every week of every month of every year. Know your workforce accreditation status at any time by viewing the OHO dashboard. Our technology is continuously monitoring your employee checks. Our notifications alert you automatically and immediately when a worker's accreditation status changes, including if it has been revoked. You'll know when employee registrations are due to expire, so you can notify them and maintain compliance. We provide an auditable, permanent record of checks that's accessible effectively forever. OHO monitors a range of accreditations across different industries, states and territories, and offers a range of integrations so you can stay up to date in one easy-to-access place. Be certain. Protect your organisation and those in your care. Try it for free at weareoho.com.
Cool. All right. I think what we'll do now, Daniel, if it's okay, is we'll move into the questions.
I'll stop
and I
sharing
can
my
see
screen.
there's lots in there. Do you want to sort of curate them and send them over?
Sure. I guess we might start with some of the ones that came in prior, and if anyone does have a question, feel free to send it directly to myself or to the broader chat. There was a an inquiry around some of the challenges that particularly our religious congregations face when they have those who are in ministry, religious, but can also be clergy who are from overseas and struggle with the identification and documentation required to actually obtain a working with children's check. Now, I know this is not essentially OHO's function. You're there once the check is obtained.
Yep.
But have you got any advice or options that might help?
Yeah, well, really just the secondary proof of identity documents. There's a very, very long list, and we understand that the Vivo check is part of that possibility as well, which would potentially be an ID that might be useful in an overseas context. And obviously the National Police Check now also checks overseas police registries. You can order one that is an international police check. So some of those things would be ways to potentially solve that problem. It is a tricky one, and we do find that our clients are quite often in need to ring the registers and have a chat to them about specific situations. And usually they're helpful. Sometimes they don't agree with the question, and we've had a chat with them about some things and got some things changed as a result of our influence, because we represent a number of organisations. So I'd encourage you to be in conversation with the register as well too.
Thanks, Claire. There was a specific question around Victoria and their spreadsheet that they provide,
yeah,
which helps in the verification, and wondering whether is that enough, or does that resolve some of the issues?
Yes, you can use the spreadsheet. It does require obviously a manual task. It's still a manual task. When you set someone up in OHO, we just start that checking on a weekly basis, and it remains there and provides a long-term audit trail. So the spreadsheet is much more difficult to produce records of what you've done when the regulator comes in to investigate. But the other thing that we do is we never delete anyone. We move them from active to inactive, and that means you've always got an audit trail. So if someone offends in 2 years' time and they come back to say, well, you know, this person was in your organisation, your defence is that you were actually verifying or part of your defence, obviously, is that you were actually verifying that person on an ongoing basis while they were with you, and that you can produce that audit trail from OHO. We would assist you to produce that audit trail. So yes, you can complete that function online using their spreadsheet. A number of our clients found that because you can only do it in a block of, I think, 50, that's also very slow and very painful. So depending on how many staff you have, it is much easier to just set people up in OHO and then have it running in the background, and then you can move them from active to inactive as appropriate.
Thanks, Claire. There has been a question which I might take, but please feel free to jump in if there's something else, just around volunteers who are performing pastoral work, namely bringing communion to the housebound or working with other vulnerable people, and whether they require a check. So our stance at ACSL is the legislation, although it can be quite confusing, steps out who is required to have a working with children's check. If you are identified, and I think this ties into your slide, Claire, around there are some particularly mentioned or prescribed entities that are under the schemes, and faith communities and churches are one of those. And so if you are a formal minister, and I think in the legislation it says minister of religion, and then it's got a whole range of examples of who would fit in that category. then it doesn't matter what your role is, you require a working with children's check because you are recognised as a minister of religion. So that, for us in the Catholic Church, applies to every priest or sister or brother who is in active ministry. When it comes to lay people in pastoral ministry, again, it does require a little bit of thinking, and part of the National Catholic Safeguarding Standards and the other elements of safeguarding ask you to do some thinking about the risks associated with various roles and their level of engagement. But if you are in a ministry role, recognised as being such, then I would say yes. If you are a volunteer and your voluntary role is not overseeing a ministry, then it will come down to the nature of your engagement and whether you work with children or not. So there was a question relating to audit, and I know you just touched on this. I wonder, Claire, do you have some examples or even anecdotal feedback that you've had from clients around an audit where OHO has been beneficial?
Yes, we have a major private school, a well-known private school in the OHO community, and their auditor went through and was amazed and gave them glowing result. And what they do, just to be very clear, is they have their teachers verifications, licenses being checked. They have their working with children on all other people in the school, and they have their contractors checked. And so, and that's being checked weekly, and the auditor was able to have a look into the system and see how, and the reporting was provided. I should have mentioned too that we do produce a board report that you're able to take to your councils or, your governing bodies that demonstrates your compliance over the months as you get better and better and raise the standard. So yes, we have had that experience, and similarly I can tell you about a story where a penalty was applied when the working with children check records were there, but the date at which they'd started verifying and the date at which they'd employed people was not part of their records, and so they were penalised because the regulator couldn't determine when they hired someone, and whether the check was completed in line with that hiring process or that appointing process. So for large organisations, there's an opportunity to integrate with OHO, and so that means every time you put on a volunteer or a employee, then it would automatically set up a record in OHO and start to verify. For those where there isn't that option, if you build it into your onboarding process that they're set up at OHO, then you know that it's going to correlate with the hiring date.
Right. Claire, there's just a question about how hard it is to set up for organisations.
Yeah, no, it's not hard. Yep, it's a good question. Data upload predominantly from an Excel spreadsheet in a specific format that we would help you with. And then it's very simple to log in. And I know that we're going to offer to everyone an opportunity to have a demo of the system after this call. You can register for that. I think it's coming out in Daniel's post-meeting email, and so please put yourself down for that. We do like to say, as Susan's just put in the chat, we like to say you can be live by lunchtime. So it really is very simple, and then you will have a really good handle on your data and how good it is. There will, for every organisation we've onboarded, there will be a cleansing period where you'll need to do the work on the records that aren't right. And then, but once you've got that cleaned up, and then of course, as you have turnover, you're constantly renewing the data. And again, that's very easy. You just bring in, all the people that you brought in the last week, you just do a little upload and it will go straight into the system.
Right. There is a question, and I think, I'm not sure how specific you can be in answering this, and perhaps we might be able to given at least some sense of how costs are structured,
Yeah.
perhaps, rather than being able
Sure.
to be specific?
Yeah, there's some pricing on the website. So it's based on the number of verifiable accreditations. And in that case, you just count up the number of working with children checks, teachers' licenses, allied health professionals. I haven't talked a lot about that, but that covers all GPs right through to physiotherapists, all those ancillary health services. That's one accreditation covers all of those. And the incoming National Disability Worker Check. So you just count all of those up. On the website, it shows there's a range of levels based on the number of accreditations, and I think the entry level, it's $45 a month for up to 50 accreditations. Over 1,000 accreditations, we'll have a talk to you, and that would be an enterprise agreement. And of course, the higher the volume, the unit price, if you like, comes down. So, yeah.
So included in that cost, which is less than $1 per person, really, per month for that lower cohort, does that include the reporting and
Yes.
all those other things?
Yep. It includes the reporting. There's no other add-ons. There's one other service I haven't talked about that is a very small incremental extra cost for another $10 a month. You can actually create your own accreditations and manage them in the system, or you can manage things that can't be verified against a register. So first aid, some of our organisations have got coaches licenses, some have have they completed a COVID marshal training, COVID-19 marshal training, those sorts of things are being managed. You can manage those in the system as well. And we did that because a lot of smaller organisations, they don't have a human resource management system. And so things like, knowing when your police check needs to be renewed is quite important. And so, yeah, so there's that service as well. But the core service, as we've said.
Great. Now, I am conscious of time. We're coming towards the end of our hour. So I might just quickly, fill 30 seconds by asking if there's anything burning that someone wishes to get answered, or at least have a comment on before we move to our close and wrapping up and just communicating where to from here, that now's the time.
Well, Daniel, while they're thinking about that, can I just answer one that came in specifically about New South Wales?
Yes.
Because it is different. And, our listeners will know that New South Wales does do the notification very well. But the places where it's got gaps is you cannot actually see inside the OCG and know that every single person you have in your organisation is linked. So if you come on to OHO, I'll explain some of the benefits. First of all, we are a backup for the OCG notification. We had a customer with a vacant child safety officer role, and the emails weren't checked for 4 months and 2 barrings had come in. So we are an insurance policy, if you like, around the notification, and that's true for Victoria as well, because Victoria still uses snail mail. And I've been speaking to organisations who, because of COVID, no one's been to the letterbox, the post office box, to pick up the letters. And then they get there and, 2 months later and find that there's barrings in there as well. So we are insurance, if you like, that we're a second notification support. We automate linking in New South Wales. So when you set up in OHO, that person will be automatically linked to the New South Wales Register. Obviously the audit for 45 years, and it's easier to use. So you can just see everyone that's linked to New South Wales in one go. And we do a regular audit to make sure that everyone you thinks with us is, you thinks with them is also recorded with us. So, and of course you can have other accreditations checked as well.
Thanks, Claire. So I think that's it for the burning questions for today. There is obviously opportunity to connect outside of the session. I might just quickly go back to the slides and we'll start to close by our 4 p.m. So please jump in, Claire, but just to note that we will provide a link to a survey or a question for anyone that is interested in having a look at OHO and going through a trial. And so we'll put that in some comms. We'll let everyone make aware. I'll send it in an email rather than putting it in the chat, so you all have it, and we'll also have a bit of an evaluation for our session. Before I go to my slide, Claire, is there anything that you wanted to add?
No, just to say thank you all for your time, and I hope that you've learnt something today. I would say that for myself, I've learnt far more about this than I expected to, and I am a mum of 2 children and had put them in programs assuming that everything was okay, and thankfully they were. But, you know, it brings it home when we remember that what we're trying to do here is protect the vulnerable and put fences around so that abuse can be stopped.
Thanks, Claire. So there's just some contact information on ACSL. The slides and some contact information for OHO will be sent directly to you after the session. So please don't stress if you haven't taken any of these things down. Thank you all for your time. Parting message from me, and just to reiterate what Claire said, it's all about ensuring that our environments are safe, that we are meeting our obligations. OHO is an option. It's a great one that might suit some of you. It may not suit some of you, and that's okay as well. It's really just an opportunity to give you some information, hopefully clarify some aspects of the complex and varying systems and schemes that are in place across the state and territories, as well as provide an option that is what we feel cost effective and perhaps will suit some of your needs. But it's not to say that you have to take it on, but it's an option. And we thank you, Claire. We thank OHO for working with us, and feel free to contact us afterwards, and we'll get you the information to get in touch with OHO and go through a trial.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Okay. Thank you. Blessings, and enjoy your afternoon. Thanks, Claire. Cheers.